Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Last night, while we were sitting around the table, my mom looked straight at my sister, smiled in that way she reserves only for her, and said the words I had heard in some version my entire life. She makes us proud. And I sat there with a plate in front of me, the sound of silverware clinking, my father nodding along, my sister looking pleased, but pretending it embarrassed her, and I felt something in me lock into place. I didn't argue, I didn't force a laugh, I didn't even glance at anyone. I stayed silent. I gathered the plates like I had done 100 times before, and then I walked out without another word. No big exit, no slam of the door, just me deciding that this was the last evening I would sit in that chair and accept the role they assigned me. People always assume these moments are born out of sudden rage, but the truth is they are the result of years of small, grinding patterns that pile up until one day, you realize you are not just ignored, but actively used. My sister Emily had always been the center of their attention, and I had always been the one who covered for what she couldn't finish. I was the one who signed her lease when she couldn't get approved on her own. I was the one who paid the overdue utility bill that, for some reason, had been put in my name when she forgot. I was the one who handed over my graduation gift savings after my mom told me it was only temporary, that it would help Emily secure her first apartment, and that I would get it back. Spoiler, I never did. And each of those moments was brushed off as family helping family, with everyone reminding me how responsible I was, as if that was supposed to feel like gratitude. That dinner wasn't even about me, and yet it was the loudest confirmation I could have asked for. It was the proof that no matter how much I worked, no matter how reliable I was, my place in this family would always be to stand quietly while they built Emily's pedestal on my back. And maybe if it were just favoritism, I could have let it slide, but I had proof, bank statements, scanned emails, credit pulls, that showed exactly how much of my life they had borrowed, repackaged, and never returned. And the thing is, once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. So when I left the table, I wasn't storming off in tears. I was making a choice. I drove home, sat at my desk, and pulled up my credit reports. I requested full files from all 3 bureaus. I placed a freeze on every account under my name. I opened a folder on my desktop and labeled it Housekeeping, and into that folder I began dragging years of scanned receipts, bank transfers, lease agreements, and emails that I had once saved out of habit, now realizing they were the map of my entire silent role. And, because I am done letting them define the narrative, I wrote a short, calm message to my mom asking for written confirmation of every outstanding obligation tied to me. No accusations, no anger, just facts. And then, right when I was about to shut my laptop, I saw the first sign that this wasn't just about the past, it was still happening. A notification popped up about a hard inquiry attempt that had been blocked by the new credit freeze. The name of the company was one I didn't recognize, but when I searched it quickly, I saw it was a boutique supplier tied to Emily's latest business project, the one they bragged about at dinner. Without my freeze, that inquiry would have gone through, and I would have been on the hook for something I had never agreed to. My silence at dinner had already paid off. I leaned back, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, not anger, not even sadness, but relief. For the first time, I wasn't reacting, I was preventing. I marked a calendar reminder for the morning, because this wasn't just a one-night decision, it was the beginning of a process, and I was determined to follow it through. Tomorrow, the family would realize I wasn't just the quiet one anymore, and they weren't going to like the new rules. And, honestly, that thought made me smile in a way I hadn't in a long time. Because if they thought I would clear the table forever, they were about to learn what happens when the person you take for granted finally stands up, stays calm, and starts pulling receipts. When I woke up the next morning, I did not feel the heaviness I usually carried after family dinners, because instead of lying in bed replaying conversations and wondering if I should have spoken up, I felt a strange calm that came only from knowing I had finally drawn a line that no one else could erase, and that today I was going to do something I had avoided for years, which was to put every single piece of evidence I had into one place. Not so that I could argue or scream or beg for recognition, but so that I could finally look at the truth with both eyes open and decide what belonged to me and what did not. I made coffee, sat down at my desk, and opened the folder I had started the night before, and as I pulled documents from old emails, scanned PDFs, and even photos of paper receipts I had taken years ago, I began to see a timeline form almost naturally, a timeline that showed just how long this pattern had existed and how many times I had told myself it was just one favor, one exception, one temporary arrangement that somehow always became permanent. The first thing I stumbled on was the bank transfer from more than a decade ago, when I had my graduation money sitting in savings, and my mom told me that Emily needed help with a deposit and it would be repaid quickly, because she just needed to get on her feet, and she assured me that families help each other, and I would never regret it. Seeing that statement again with the transfer clearly marked into an account that my mom controlled, not Emily, not me, but my mom, hit me like a weight on my chest, because it meant this wasn't just Emily leaning on me, it was my mom orchestrating it, and all those years of me feeling guilty for being resentful weren't about selfishness at all, they were about being lied to from the start. Then I found an email chain from when Emily's utilities had supposedly gotten mixed up, and she asked me if I could put one in my name just for a few months until she fixed her credit score. And my mom had chimed in telling me not to be dramatic and to remember that Emily's future depended on a little flexibility from me, and yet there in black and white was the bill months later still in my name, unpaid, and eventually sent to collections, which explained the ding on my credit I had spent months cleaning up without ever telling anyone, because at the time I thought I had just made some mistake that was my fault. But the one that made my stomach flip was something I had forgotten entirely, a Word document saved in a folder labeled Memories, which I had backed up years ago when I cleared out an old laptop. And when I opened it, I realized it was my college entrance essay, the one I had spent weeks on, the one I had poured myself into, the one I had left behind and never thought about again. Until I remembered the way a church friend had praised Emily recently for the way her business grant application was written, quoting a line that had felt eerily familiar, and suddenly here it was, word for word, lifted from my essay and dropped into her application as if she had written it herself, which meant not only that my mom had kept the file, but that somehow it had ended up in Emily's hands, transformed into her original work. I was not crying, I was not shaking, I was not even angry in that moment, because what I felt was sharper than anger, it was clarity, and with that clarity came the certainty that I did not need anyone's permission to act. I took all of it, the transfers, the utility statements, the essay file with its metadata showing the original date, and I created a neat, simple packet, a timeline of events with attached documents, nothing emotional, nothing accusatory. Just facts, because I knew that once this existed in a single place, the story my family had always told about me being overly sensitive or remembering wrong would no longer work. I sent that packet privately to my dad, not my mom, because I wanted to see what he would do when confronted with evidence that was impossible to dismiss, and in the email I asked him to look it over and tell me if anything was inaccurate. And I gave him a deadline noon, because I wasn't leaving room for endless stalling anymore. For a few hours, there was silence, and I almost let myself think that maybe he would come back with an apology or at least an acknowledgement that he had known more than he had admitted. But then just before noon my phone buzzed, and there it was. A short reply from him that said, "Please do not send this to your mother yet," which was a strange choice of words, because it meant he wasn't denying the contents, he wasn't questioning the accuracy, he was only trying to delay the inevitable, and when I checked the message details, my heart sank and hardened at the same time. He had forwarded my packet to my mom only minutes earlier. That was the moment I knew I wasn't in control of how they would react, but I was in control of what I did next, and that was enough, because now the truth was out, the receipts were in circulation, and there was no way to put them back into the drawer labeled "Family Business" ever again. The moment my dad forwarded the packet to my mom, the tone of the family shifted in a way that I had always expected but never actually seen in real time, because within an hour the family group chat that usually carried only birthday reminders, photos of my nieces, and endless updates about Emily's projects suddenly turned into a storm of messages, each one more frantic than the last, filled with pleas, guilt trips, accusations, and all the usual phrases they reached for when they wanted me to shrink back into silence, with my mom writing that I was breaking her heart by dredging up old favors, my dad asking me to stop overreacting before things get worse, and Emily firing off a series of messages about how business deals were delicate and how I could ruin everything by making things official, as if my only role in this family was to act as a shield for her choices. And as I sat there reading the stream of words that all seemed designed to confuse me into second-guessing myself, I realized something important. Their panic was not about lies being told, it was about truth finally having proof behind it. For years they had relied on me avoiding confrontation, on me not wanting to upset the fragile balance that made dinners tolerable and holidays survivable. But once my packet of documents was out there, they could not spin the story anymore. And that was the moment I knew I had to take the next step. The one that would not just stop future damage, but would make it impossible for them to quietly use my name again. During my lunch break, I walked into a notary office near my job, carrying a folder with selected documents and a statement I had written that morning, which laid out in simple terms how my name had been used without permission, which accounts had been opened, and which obligations had been assigned to me without my consent, and I signed it in front of the notary, who stamped it and slid it back across the desk to me, asking if I wanted additional copies, and I took 3, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just collecting proof, I was formalizing it in a way no one could deny. Once I had that affidavit, I felt something shift inside me, as if the years of carrying other people's weight were finally being set down, not with shouting, not with tears, but with paperwork, signatures, and official stamps, which may sound boring, but in reality carried more power than all the emotional appeals in the world. I used the rest of my break to mail revocation letters to 2 companies where my authorization might still be on file, one of them the utility that Emily had tied me to years ago, and the other a small supplier that had already attempted to run a credit check the night before. I also filed dispute notices online, attaching scans of the affidavit so that any lingering traces of those obligations would be flagged and reviewed. By the time I returned to work, my phone was buzzing nonstop, and when I finally looked during a short break, the group chat had turned into a playbook I could have predicted. My mom insisting that these were private family matters that did not belong in legal documents, my dad pleading that I should stop embarrassing them, and Emily accusing me of sabotaging her career out of jealousy, because in her mind, nothing could ever be about accountability, it had to be about envy. But I did not reply to any of them. Instead, I sat quietly at my desk, knowing that my next move would carry more weight than any argument typed into a chat. That evening, when I got home, I drafted a short, polite email to Mrs. Green, the tax preparer who had handled our family's taxes for as long as I could remember. A woman who had always treated me with kindness even as she worked with my parents behind the scenes. In my email, I explained that I would now be filing as a completely separate household, that no deductions or credits should ever again be tied to my name unless they were directly documented by me, and that I had attached copies of my affidavit along with supporting statements. I pressed send, half expecting it would take days for her to reply, but within the hour a notification popped up, and there it was, a message from her that was short, direct, and shocking in its own way. Because she wrote, "I have been uncomfortable about this for years. There are things you need to see. Please call me this evening." When I read that line, I felt both vindicated and unsettled, because it confirmed what I had always suspected, that this wasn't just me being sensitive or dramatic. That even an outsider had noticed the way my identity and finances were being entangled with Emily's life. But it also meant there were details I had not uncovered yet, details that might reveal just how deep this pattern of borrowing and hiding truly went. I set the phone down, leaned back, and let the weight of that sink in, because while my family had been filling the chat with noise, I now had something louder than all their words combined: paper, signatures, and an ally who had quietly been watching it all unfold. And that, more than anything they could type, told me that the real story was only beginning to come out. When Mrs. Green told me she had been uncomfortable for years and that there were things I needed to see, I knew immediately that the surface of what I had uncovered was nothing compared to the depth of the arrangements my parents had quietly woven together. And so later that evening, with my hands steady even though my heart was racing, I called her, and in that calm, practiced voice of someone who had spent decades preparing tax returns and smoothing over financial tangles, she explained that my name had been appearing in places I had never authorized, deductions and credits tied to me, but claimed under my parents' household filings, scholarships that I had earned through my own work but listed as Emily's reported income, and even certain education credits that had been rerouted, all done under the explanation that it's family and families pool resources. What she told me wasn't simply disappointing, it was enraging in the most quiet way, because it confirmed that my parents hadn't just borrowed money from me informally, they had treated my existence as a tool to optimize their narrative of success, and they had counted on me never paying close enough attention to notice. I listened as she laid out specific years, line items, and attached scanned records that showed Emily's name in places where mine should have been, and I realized that the story my family had been feeding to everyone, the church community, the extended relatives, even their neighbors, was built on a foundation of stolen credit, stolen words, and stolen opportunities. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was the construction of an image where Emily was always the golden child, the achiever, the ambitious one, while I was the quiet one who supposedly preferred staying in the background, when in truth it was my work, my finances, and even my writing that had been fueling that image. By the time I hung up the call, I wasn't angry in the way they expected me to be. I was resolute. I sat at my desk, opened a new document, and began writing down every single way my name, my credit, my savings, or my words had been used without permission. It was no longer just a folder of receipts. It was a comprehensive record, a plain-spoken narrative that I could stand behind without raising my voice, because once everything was on paper, the lies collapsed under their own weight. I drafted a short note to Emily's former landlord, attaching the affidavit and disputing the false utility record still tied to my name, making it clear that if anything about that account appeared again, it would be treated as fraud. I sent a similar message to the supplier who had attempted to pull my credit the night after the dinner, revoking any authorization and attaching my notarized statement. But perhaps the most important action I took that night was addressing the theft of my words, because I attached the original metadata stamped essay file to a calm, factual message addressed to the grant committee reviewing Emily's latest application, writing that portions of her submission matched my college essay word for word, and that while I wasn't accusing anyone of malicious intent, I wanted to assert my authorship so that no confusion existed should questions arise later. I didn't add emotional pleas or accusations. I simply laid the documents side by side, letting the comparison speak louder than I ever could. Meanwhile, the family group chat continued its spiral, my mom typing paragraph after paragraph about how I was humiliating them by dragging private family matters into the open, my dad asking me if I could at least pause until things calmed down, and Emily alternating between rage and self-pity, claiming I was jealous, claiming I wanted to see her fail, claiming I didn't understand how hard she had worked to get where she was. But none of their words moved me anymore, because the weight of documentation is something no argument can erase, and I had already chosen to put everything in writing, which meant the control they once had over my silence was gone. At that point, I decided it was time to speak not with explanations, but with boundaries, and so I posted one short message in the group chat. I am separating my finances and my name from all of you. This is not punishment. This is repair. Attached was a simple repayment plan, not cruel, not inflated, just the exact amounts borrowed or misused over the years, calculated clearly with dates and sources, and with terms that even a bank would call generous, 0 interest, and the option to repay in small installments if they started within 30 days. I made it clear that if they did not begin, the matter would go to small claims, where the same receipts would be presented without any chance of dismissal. The silence that followed that message was unlike the noisy storm that had filled the chat before, and for a brief moment I thought maybe they were finally processing the reality that this was not going away, but then, as I was about to set down my phone, it rang. And when I answered, it was Emily, her voice sharp but quieter than usual, and she said one line that stuck with me. If you do this, Mom will break. And then, after a pause, she added something that chilled me more than I expected. Also, you are not the only one with copies. And before I could ask what she meant, the line went dead. I sat there in my living room, the screen still glowing, the silence pressing in, and I realized that the next move wasn't just about boundaries and repayments anymore. It was about secrets I hadn't yet uncovered. Secrets that my sister seemed to think could still be used against me, and in that moment, I understood that the fight was no longer just about receipts and accounts, it was about the story itself. About who controlled the version of events that everyone else believed, and that realization carried me straight into the next day with a sharper sense of what was at stake. The morning after Emily's call, when she warned me that Mom would break and that I wasn't the only one with copies, I woke up not with fear, but with a kind of sharp alertness. The kind you feel when you know the next step will determine whether everything you have built so far holds steady or collapses under pressure. And as I checked my phone, I saw the family group chat flooded with messages sent overnight, most of them frantic, disjointed, and filled with panic, with my mom insisting she hadn't slept because she couldn't stop crying, my dad typing messages that shifted between begging for calm and pleading for me to reconsider, and Emily alternating between threats and desperate explanations about how much of her reputation depended on me not destroying everything, as if my refusal to stay silent was more destructive than years of them quietly using my name, my money, and even my words to support the life she had built. I knew that if I let myself be drawn into that noise, I would end up right back in the role I had been trained for since childhood, the one where I soothed, absorbed, and backed down so that everyone else could keep their picture of a happy family intact. So instead of replying, I turned off notifications, opened my laptop, and prepared the final step I had been building toward since the moment I walked away from the dinner table. I drafted a clean, 2-page document titled, "Before You Hear a Story," and in it I laid out the timeline of what had been borrowed, taken, or signed in my name. I listed the repayment amounts owed with sources and dates. And I included a clear statement that from this day forward I would not co-sign, I would not lend, and I would not ghostwrite for anyone again, because I was done being the foundation for someone else's narrative. I attached the affidavit, I attached a repayment plan, and I scheduled the document to be sent later that afternoon to a select group of relatives who had always heard only the version of events my parents controlled, because if my family wanted to lean on public opinion, then I was going to make sure that the truth, backed by paper and not excuses, was part of the record too. At the same time, I reviewed the messages I had already sent to institutions outside the family, and the responses were beginning to arrive in ways that confirmed I wasn't simply fighting shadows. The grant committee had replied, stating that Emily's application was now on hold pending review, and while they were careful not to accuse anyone publicly, their tone carried the weight of authority, and I knew that, even if they never said the words outright, they had seen the plagiarism as clearly as I had. Emily's business partner, Tyler, had sent a text asking if we could talk privately and work something out, but I ignored it because I had already prepared and sent a formal cease and desist letter regarding the unauthorized use of my essay. And there was nothing left to negotiate when it came to my own work. The old landlord had acknowledged receipt of my affidavit and confirmed that the unpaid utility account would be flagged as fraudulent, ensuring it could no longer appear under my credit. Every response, every acknowledgement, felt like another brick sliding out from under the carefully built image my family had spent years maintaining, and for once, I wasn't the one holding it up. When the time for the so-called family meeting came, I agreed to attend, but only under my conditions. It had to be in a neutral place, it had to involve written terms, and Mrs. Green would provide the financial summary she had compiled. Sitting at that table with my parents and my sister, I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I didn't even let them pull me into the emotional tug-of-war they had always relied on. I simply presented the repayment terms, repeated that this was not punishment but repair, and reminded them that the same documents were already backed up, notarized, and distributed. There was no longer any way for them to make this disappear. The moment that broke the tension came not through words but through action. During that meeting, as they argued and pleaded and shifted blame, my phone buzzed with a notification of a transfer into my account. The exact first installment of repayment that matched one of the listed debts, and when I checked the details, I saw it had come from my mom, quietly, without announcing it, without even acknowledging it in the room. That single transfer was not just money, it was the first tangible admission that the story I had put into writing was undeniable, and that even if they never said the words out loud, they knew the truth was no longer theirs to control. I stood up before the meeting ended, told them I had said what I needed to say, and walked out without waiting for resolution, because for once, I didn't need their approval to feel that something was finished. As I drove home, the group chat began buzzing again, but this time it wasn't filled with threats or guilt. It was only one line from my mom, a sentence I had never seen her write before: "I am sorry." I stared at it, not trusting it completely, not expecting it to erase decades of silence and favoritism, but knowing that in its own way it was proof that the balance had shifted forever. The brilliance of the moment wasn't in revenge that destroyed anyone or in some dramatic confrontation. It was in the quiet reality that I had finally turned their system against itself, using documents, facts, and timing to break free from the role they had kept me in for so long. I didn't know if this was the beginning of repair or simply the final chapter of pretending we were the family they wanted everyone to see, but I knew without question that I had won, not by screaming, not by begging, but by forcing the truth into the open and refusing to carry their weight any longer. And as I closed my laptop that night, watching the folder labeled "Housekeeping" sit calmly on my screen, I realized that sometimes the most powerful revenge is not revenge at all, but the decision to take back what was always yours and never hand it over again.